All right, so here we are at the end of semester. It's been a great ride. This is the final assignment for health and physical education, which is well, time flies, doesn't it? So I hope you haven't been too bored so far. I'm gonna try keep it a little bit entertaining, rather than your standard response and all that whatnot. So let's try and keep you a little bit engaged. I know that speeches can obviously be sometimes a little bit stale, so I'm going to try and do something to maybe keep it a little bit more influx. So that said, let's just dive straight into this. So right here, I have a question for, well, what is the educational importance of HPE? I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but obviously I need to explain it. So there's just a lot of real-life contextual stuff that students and teachers can draw from the content that gets taught in physical education, and that goes as far as alcohol, movement skills, drugs, alcohol, testing yourself physically, um, and all of that. And I'm going to drive on some personal experience here, because I came from an area that wasn't exactly A grade standard. There was always problems with drugs and alcohol in the actual student community, as low as year 8, and I think it got as low as year 7 at one point when I was in year 12. So that goes to show a lot. So this kind of education is so important to kids at that age, because I can tell you now that I came from a parental background where that was like blacklisted stuff. So obviously they weren't very informative when it came to that stuff. So I depended on a lot of the information I got about drugs and alcohol from physical education. Now, it's definitely a subject where a lot of students don't take it seriously for a number of reasons. But it's also a subject where students understand that what they learn in here is actually relevant to what happens to them or what they may encounter in their outside life, outside of school. Um, and I think that's a pretty universal. And I think that in itself is essential to not only student knowledge, but the whole growing up process. Because sometimes parents just don't feel comfortable talking about this stuff, and this is what a really good way of delivering this information and vital information to kids. Um, it's just all about preparedness, really. So yeah, from a student perspective, yeah, it's essential, and that's one of the educational importances. So I came back to that point. So what are some of the considerations you may will make when selecting HPE resources for your teaching? Uh, the number one approach that I'm going to slap in here is the strengths-based approach. It was kind of a term that I wasn't really too familiar with coming into this course. I kind of heard about it, but I didn't really know much about it. It's kind of self-explanatory, but it's also kind of not at the same time. It's playing on student strengths rather than, that kind of shock and awe factor, which I will get into. Um, but basically, this emphasis on empowering the students or student agency to go out and solve problems based on their context or whatever. That there are always ways of doing things without presenting this sort of crazy death and destruction mantra surrounding drugs and alcohol and all that whatnot, such as just helplines and stuff. So that kind of strengths-based approach, empowering the students, not scaring them, is probably the number one thing that I'm taking away from this unit, and it's definitely something that I'm going to be implementing in subjects outside uh, physical education. I do actually have reservations though regarding the kind of style when it comes to secondary specialization and how to implement resources or methods um, related to HPE into my specialist, which is history. I do find it quite hard to see where that fits. I mean, I'm still learning quite a bit of this. I wouldn't call myself a physical and health education expert by no means, even after the subject. I mean, I'm going to be real. This is the first health and physical education subject that I've done since year 10, and that was somewhere between 6 and 8 years ago. I've lost track. Um, But that just goes to show, you know, my level of understanding of this whole area. So I guess there's always going to be reservations I have in regarding to how comfortable I feel about implementing this kind of stuff, and that's a reflection on my own practice. Um, but another thing of health physical education resources is the notion of outsourcing. And I know that this is a subject that's not necessarily specific to health and physical education, but it's something that you definitely see perhaps a lot more of. And I think that's reflective of, as I just mentioned, teacher preparedness when it comes to this subject. Um, like myself, there are a lot of people in the same boat that, you know, don't necessarily feel A grade confident when it comes to teaching health and physical education because, just like me, it's been a while since they've touched on it. It's been a while since they've taught about it. There's a lot of stuff that may have changed, be different, the same, whatever. But that's why we probably feel the need to outsource. And that's one of the considerations that I would take in is that it needs to be related to the curriculum. And that's, I think that's, Rosie, if you are the one marking this, um, it's something you brought up in one of the tutorials is that sometimes that outsourcing doesn't necessarily lead to better learning outcomes because it doesn't necessarily reflect the curriculum. And that's also something that we talked a lot about, my group and I, when we were developing our own unit guides. So, well, I'll touch more about that later. So I'll move on now. And here we have how do students learn in, through, and about physical education? So we'll start off with in, and this is very going to be very theoretical for me. So we're talking about all the procedural and deep learning aspects of learning through physical movement. And I'm such a big advocate for this because I use this all the time when I'm on placement in primary schools. I don't use it as much in high schools because it is a bit harder to get those kind of guys and girls to be enthusiastic, we'll say, to getting up and jumping around and doing all that whatnot. So um, that's always. Hang on, is this recording? Yes, it is. Um, that would have been awkward if it wasn't. So where was this? So yeah, deep learning. Um, Deep learning is such a powerful tool, and you can do a lot of this through movement. I mean, the it's just endless, and I'll touch more about this when we do through learning, through physical education. But that whole aspect of the conceptual and then doing the procedural, so the physical, manipulative aspects of learning is so beneficial for students. And I am yet to see the majority of the class be unresponsive to this type of learning. So I'm all on board for this. So that kind of deep learning and kinesthetic approaches to learning is always going to be something that I value and would actually encourage teachers um, to pursue. I know it's not necessarily something they're going to want to do, but whatever. So we'll go on to through. So I could apply mathematics to this. I could apply history to this. I can apply so many things to do this. I'll touch on it briefly because we are running a bit over time. So we're doing through learning, through physical movement. So kids can basically pick up what they're learning. They can scale it, manipulate it, touch it, feel it, move it. You know, all these things, you know, the things that they're learning in books, in theory, on the chalkboard or whatever, the whiteboard. Um, all of a sudden they can move it and understand it much more. Take money, for example. I know it's not exactly, you know, the most physical education, but, you know, they could learn on the board the values and all that whatnot. But then all of a sudden you'll get math manipulatives out and coins, and all of a sudden you get the kids to explore how many ways they can make a dollar or all this kind of stuff. You know, it's basic movement skills, but they're still moving. You know, they're not sitting there and writing it down, and that's one of the most important, most valuable lessons that I think any teacher can do or give their students is providing them that those real just basically knowing how the students learn, and that's one of the standards in Australian professional standards for teaching. Not the one I chose, but we'll get into that later. So I'll move on to where am I? Bear with me. About. So I think this was Rosie as well. You mentioned to me that Gymnastics actually wasn't in the curriculum, and I'm not going to lie, I'm not an expert on what is and what's not in the HBE curriculum. Uh, but when you mentioned that wasn't in the curriculum, that really threw me because I remember doing it every single term, or every at least every single year in high school because well, it just turns out that there's just so much more fundamental movement skills that you can learn in there. And that goes the same for ball games and all that stuff as well. And something I never really considered as a student, but as a teacher looking back, I really understand a lot of what they were doing, such as balance, forward rolls, just simple jumps and passes and arm movements, all that good stuff. So yeah, that's how they can learn about movement is through gymnastics and that kind of stuff. So we'll move on to how does assessment task 2 show developing practice with APTS. APST, excuse me. So I chose responsible use of ICT. I'm a big ICT guy. I wouldn't call myself an expert by any means. I mean, I had to ask someone how to use a snippet tool the other day, so innocent until proven guilty. But we used a website as a form of assessment tool that students could engage with. And why this is a responsible approach to uh, learning through ICT is that it's secure. I mean, when people hear websites and all that whatnot, they may think that anyone can contact them, but you can't if you do not provide that tool of communication. So when students are applying all this information or whatnot, it has to be checked off by the teacher. Obviously before it goes live, and when it goes live, the teachers will mark it because they will have direct hyperlinks. But then you've got to remember how many websites are going to be out there for